Hey everyone, welcome back to Let's Unpack That with Alex and Grace. We are so thrilled today to have Anthony Kennada, CEO and co-founder of AudiencePlus, or I like to call him AK for short. So AK actually has a pretty impressive background in marketing and business, most recently founding and leading AudiencePlus, but he's also been chief marketing officer at other companies like Gainsight. I remember AK and I met at our company conference, our annual company conference. And then AK invited me to go to one of their fellowship and prayer meetings super early in the morning, like 7 a.m. But I was like, yeah, let's do it. And so I've always admired AK just from the way that he conducts business, and he's very successful in his career, but also a strong, passionate follower of Jesus, which obviously I really, really love the intersection of the two. So today we're going to understand who AK is at the heart level, but also really talk about how do you integrate spiritual disciplines with your work, especially if you have like a high demand, fast paced job.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here, Anthony. We're so honored to have you. And yeah, maybe just to start off, can you kind of share a little bit of backstory? How did you end up doing what you're doing right now?
Yeah, thank you guys. I'm so excited to be on the show. It's a big question. I mean, I think no one sort of grows up dreaming of working in enterprise software. I feel like you sort of just find your path there. For me, just as I look back on kind of the signals of my life, there were kind of shades of marketing kind of from my earliest days, like, building websites, kind of in my very young days. In college, my job on campus was to be a concert coordinator, so putting on events. And then even in my earliest jobs as an SDR and kind of frontline tech professional, I found my way into the events teams that were putting on events and conferences. So I feel like I've always had this sort of draw to creative side of marketing. And what's really ironic is I didn't pursue a career in marketing. It was Alex, our former CEO, Nick, who asked me if I would be willing to take a marketing role at Gainsight, and that completely sort of, changed my life. So yeah, I mean, I think I've kind of just been pushing the thread, or whatever the saying is, like just walking through doors that God had been opening up in my life and career, and just trying to be faithful. And, even this jump into becoming a founder, which, I know we'll talk about, wasn't something that I set out to do, from my earliest days of my career, just sort of walking through those doors that I feel are being opened. So yeah, so that's a very high level journey, but, something that I think is a story that is still being written in a way. And it's kind of fun to see what God's doing.
Yeah, I love seeing your journey, and you definitely had a very incredible career. Love to know, were you always creative? Were there any significant moments in your earlier years that really sparked this curiosity towards marketing?
I've never answered that question before. I've never done the introspection to really know. I mean, I think one thing is I'm an only child raised by single immigrant mom. Same. Yeah. So my mom immigrated here from Lebanon in the 1970s, I want to say, 80s. And kind of grew up balancing that culture at home and then my integration into the world. And a lot of that was me spending a lot of time alone, frankly, and I think I don't know if this is correlated, but, developing creativity when you're kind of working your imagination. For me, a lot of that happened on the basketball court, just kind of being out there by myself, shooting hoops, thinking. So I suspect that was like a part of it. The other piece is that I remember distinctly getting an Apple computer, or like being handed down like an old Apple computer when I was like, I don't know, 10 or something to that end. It didn't do anything but like Paint or whatever the Apple equivalent of Paint was. But it was a chance to tinker with something new and just load in like 4 CD-ROMs till I get one game going or whatever. So I think that there was sort of an intersection, less so on the creative side, but more on the technology side, that I think kind of whet my appetite for innovation or what's new. And I think a lot of just sort of ideas that I'd kind of come up with over time, I think as a child helps kind of strengthen that muscle a little bit, perhaps.
First of all, I can totally relate. Both me and Alex, we're also only children. We talk about this a lot, how when you're alone, you have nothing else to entertain yourself but you.
Right.
So you learn to be creative. I think the first, besides Microsoft Paint, I remember being on Jask Paint Shop Pro.
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
Yeah, spending hours. It was like the budget version of Photoshop. Like I wasn't ready for that yet. But it's just so funny how God puts those seeds in and it leads you to where you are now. And maybe before we, talk about right now and like what you've been learning recently, can you talk a little bit also about your faith? Did you grow up in a Christian home? Like, were you aware of God leading you in these steps, or was it more in retrospect you realized like he was there?
Yeah, so I grew up in a Greek Orthodox home. And so if you've ever watched My Big Fat Greek Wedding, that was my entire
Yes.
childhood, basically. Yeah, so you're familiar. The lamb, the painted garage door, everything, except not the painted garage door. But I grew up in a prayerful home, a home that like my mom really instilled a lot of the values in me. And I went to Lutheran preschool, Greek Orthodox elementary school, Baptist high school, and Church of Christ college. So I'm a product of Christian education as well. And I think for me, the big shift happened between elementary school and high school, sort of growing up again, in more of, as we talk about disciplines, especially like more of a sort of branch of our faith or a denomination that celebrated a bit more of the ritual, perhaps. And then I got into high school where there were like electric guitars and like people putting their hands up in the air. And I was like, what is going on? Like, is this the same, faith that I know? What first was a little bit setting, like I just didn't know how to process that, really sparked this journey for me of developing sort of my own faith, not just inheriting the faith of my family and my mom in particular. And so I think I credit that phase of my kind of walk as more of my own kind of asking some questions, and really kind of, the part I'm really like proud of and grateful for is asking those questions in the context of a community of non-denominational believers and Christians. And, I got a chance to play in a worship band even before I knew like what worship bands were. And that was a chance to really kind of build relationship and have exposure to, again, the personhood and the relationship of and with Jesus. So that was sort of one of the big transitions for me. But I would argue, like even from my earliest days, I've definitely had sort of a awareness of the Holy Spirit and just the sort of work being done in my life, in personal side or work side or anything, not knowing kind of what God had planned for me, but just knowing that even though I was walking and living through the work and school context or sports or whatever, that there was sort of a higher calling for all of my actions and words and behavior. And that was always something that I think was front of mind for me, and having that awareness my earliest days.
I can totally relate to that because I grew up in a Catholic home where it was more traditional, and I would go to mass, but didn't really understand it until, similar to you, actually more in college. Went to a worship service where it was more contemporary, modern, and that totally piqued my curiosity. It wasn't, I guess, boring or it was more modern. Like I could relate to it more. So totally can understand your story. But were there any significant moments in your life that really drew you more to Jesus? Like what was the spark that really put your foot forward?
There's two in particular, and one more recent than the other. One was honestly my relationship with my wife. Like our significant others play such an important part of our own development and formation, whether that is relationally or, I think even spiritually. And, there was a moment early on in our dating relationship where I was like, I felt like I wasn't walking the walk in a way that I was sort of worthy of her love in a way. There was sort of this reckoning moment for me of saying like, hey, if I want to be deserving of the love of someone like Brittany, I've got to sort of change things in my life, and I need to reorient myself a little bit. So that was one big moment of having gone to church. I was never sort of like a troublemaker or anything, but like just like some real shifts in my heart that I had to make, and then translate that into my actions and make sure that I was sort of living in a way that was leading me to a Christ-centered relationship, which almost 10 years into marriage now and 2 kids later, I look back on that moment as a very important one. The other one was fairly recent and kind of, I think, leads us a bit into the spiritual disciplines and spiritual practices. But I had a very random health scare 3 years ago where actually my heart went out of rhythm into something called an arrhythmia called AFib, which is the most common arrhythmia, but the average age is like 86. It is not common for 30-year-olds to experience AFib. And I'll spare the long story, but it's basically this struggle for about a week in the hospital of trying to get my heart back in rhythm and nothing working. Chemical, medicine they were putting into me through an IV was supposed to get me back into rhythm. It didn't work. The next option was to shock my heart into rhythm, which, by the way, is actually
scary.
It sounds terrifying. It's a very like standard, normal procedure. but I don't want to reset my heart. That sounds like, terrifying. And so I was doing literally everything I could to avoid having the shock of having to have my heart reset for me. And there was this moment that it led to, again, days and days into the hospital where they're like, there's nothing else we can do for you. Like, this is literally the only way to get your heart back in rhythm. And so I had this sort of moment of surrender. And it was really kind of this very vulnerable and raw kind of conversation with God of like, look, and again, I didn't appreciate at the time how common this procedure was, but if like literally, if this is it, if this is the end of my life, if as a result of tomorrow of the procedure tomorrow, I'm going to heaven, I just fully give control away on this situation, and I just pray that you love me and accept me and forgive me of my sin. And so the next morning felt like literally the last morning of my life. Like I'm very dramatic as an only child too. I don't know if you guys are as well.
We are too.
Okay, good. And they checked me, and I'm still in AFib, and they wheel me down to like not the operating room, but the place that they would do the procedure. They are like getting me ready for the procedure. They're about to administer anesthesia to shock my heart. And the nurse says, hey, doctor, is this the guy we're doing the cardioversion on? And he's like, yeah. She's like, he's in rhythm. And it was within the 3-minute walk or gurney ride down from the hospital room to the center where God reset my heart after medical intervention did not. They're like, cool, you can go. That's it. Like I just went on with my life afterwards.
Oh my gosh.
And it was this profound moment for me of like literally the poetic metaphor as a creative or marketer was almost too much to bear, that God reset my heart for me for a purpose. And it sparked in me this just revival of faith and this journey that I've been on for the last, again, about 3 years or so with my family, that has gone from sort of participation in church and having sort of a rhythm around prayer, but fairly high level, going through the motions, fitting God in where I could fit him in, to this like transformation of meaning and purpose, but also this active kind of discipleship quest that my family and I are on, which led us to the practices, which led us to, frankly, a bit more of a charismatic, perhaps, side of our faith, to see the Holy Spirit work in our lives, in the lives of our community and others. So it's been a crazy 3 years of really pursuing that. Feels like we're just kind of getting started.
That is amazing. I have goosebumps right now. You can't see, but that is such a crazy story. I think it reminds me of, recently actually we interviewed another lady, Alicia Michelle, on the topic of overcoming overwork. And it's just crazy how many people like myself, Alicia, you, I'm sure so many others, actually another one, David Kim too. We all have like health scares that kind of gave you renewed clarity on life. Because I think most of the time we go through life lost or confused because we don't have that clarity or we forget what's actually important. And so, wow, what a blessing in disguise to give you that little scare to kind of shock you into realizing what's actually important, how to prioritize God and surrender to him. Thanks for sharing. I think now we have a kind of a good idea, high level overview of your personal upbringing, your faith, and we now want to bring those two together, like especially a CEO and a co-founder. I know it's a very unique spot that you are in. So if someone were to come to you and say, hey, Anthony, like as a CEO and co-founder, how do you bridge these two worlds? How do you integrate your faith with your work? What would you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, a few things. So I'd start with a disclaimer of I am not perfect. I am figuring this out. I am on a journey just like everyone that is listening to this. So please don't hear anything that I say as like, man, this guy's got it figured out, because I definitely don't. But one kind of big thing that was realized through that experience was that work is not my identity. And that sounds like simple to say, but to deeply believe that work instead is an expression of my purpose. And that through everything that I do, and almost like thinking about our very design as humans in God's image to work, that sort of like be able to build some resilience to our relationship with work. When things go bad, it's not going to sink our identity if we, heaven forbid, are laid off or whatever. Like, things happen in the run of work, and we don't lose sort of our footing and our foundation when that stuff happens. And we also keep some of the highs in perspective a little bit too, closing a big deal, saving a customer, launching a product, hosting a conference, whatever. There's a lot of dopamine hits in business. And I think being appreciative and joyful and loving those moments, but then kind of just keeping work sort of in perspective is kind of where I start. And the second thing, which has been especially helpful as a founder, has been integrating sort of and creating really a rule of life around that relationship with work. I've got 2 small kids at home. I mentioned my wife and I are almost at 10 years of marriage. Like, it's important to me to have appreciation for how important work is in context of purpose, but also knowing that my faith and my family come first, hands down. Like, being very transparent about that, right? With customers, whatever. Not that it comes up in every customer call, but like that's fundamentally like how I am built and driven. And so having a rule of life has really been helpful to just establish a lot of the rhythms that can help me be productive when I am at work, but then also help me be a leader in the home, leader to my children, and build a relationship with my children. That's, I think, a big part of it, is establishing sort of a rule of life. And then third, I would say, is maybe uniquely as a founder, integrating the rule of life into the culture that you're creating. We're in a unique position as founders that we're not just inheriting another culture, we're able to shape it into something. And so, we're thinking about some fun and interesting ways to basically, we're not a Christian nonprofit or anything along those lines, but how can we think about some of these underlying principles around rest and, integrity, and find ways to kind of build those into the fabric of how we build the company and how we run the company. And I think these are universally held principles. They're hard coded into the design of humanity. And so if we're able to kind of build for that, you're able to create a great workplace, and also help folks, for those that are believers and are pursuing Jesus, that work is sort of a healthy part of that walk.
Wow, that's amazing. For a lot of our listeners, they may not know what a rule of life is. So, AK, can you explain what a rule of life is?
Yeah. One last disclaimer is this is all new to me the last 3 years. And so this is stuff that I'm shocked has not been taught in the local church, has not been, at least as far in my own kind of lived experience, has not been something that has been on the forefront of our, best practice in faith. But there's nothing more ancient and orthodox than this, which is a big part of the aha moment that I've had with all of this. So rule of life is effectively saying that we're going to build rhythms into how we operate and live in this, in our time here on earth, to live in tune with the Spirit, to live and kind of build sort of practices within how we operate that are in line with our divine creation, or how we were sort of created. So basically, this is something that I would imagine, I'm not a church historian or anything, but in like the post-Enlightenment, like we've kind of moved away from some of these things. But even if you look back in the last 50, 60 years within, America, where we are here, there have been things like, call it a Sabbath, that have been kind of in the fabric of how we operated as a culture and society. In a lot of places in this country, you still can't, buy liquor on Sundays. Stores are still closed on Sundays. And we've really, I think, moved away from some of the rule of life practices, at least at that intersection point with culture, really in the last several decades. But I'd argue even the church has been so focused on evangelism, which is great and amazing, and we need that we sort of lost our own kind of habitual communal experiences with things like fasting and things like, listening prayer and hospitality and community. And we've sort of just kind of forgotten some of these things. And so I think a rule of life is basically adopting some of these practices into how, and integrating them into how we operate, whether that's as a family, whether that's as an individual, and kind of creating a more healthy relationship with our schedule and with our time and with our relationship to others.
How did you come across the rule of life and these spiritual disciplines? Because I think a lot of people might abstractly have heard of them, but how did you actually start to learn and move into, like you were talking about, creating a rule of life or these disciplines for your company that you run?
This is going to be a very long story told very fast. So otherwise I'll take the whole time. But it was right before COVID, right during the beginning part of COVID, during the protests that were happening around George Floyd's murder and all of the kind of racial tension, and folks were kind of taking to the streets. I remember feeling so just heavy and heartbroken over what was happening in our country and in our culture. And it was a Saturday. And I remember going to church that Sunday, just wanting to hear just something about how can I, as a believer, respond to injustice and have a proactive kind of step forward in this way. I just didn't know how, I wasn't equipped with how to deal with this hurt. And I went to the church that we were attending at the time. It wasn't addressed. People didn't bring it up. The past never got brought up from the pulpit. And the message that was preached was around like joy or something that felt very disconnected from what was happening. Tone deaf. Yeah. And that was so confusing to me because I was like, gosh, how can we move on? How can we be equipped and be discipled in a way where we know how to respond in like outside of this place we spend an hour and a half every Sunday. Right. And at the time, I was reading a book called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Mark Comer.
Such a good book.
Such a good book. And it was, I didn't know who he was. I didn't know anything about it, but I'm reading this book and just like taking it all in, right? COVID happens. And I was like, all right, who's this John Mark Comer guy? Research him. And he's a pastor of a church at the time in Portland, Oregon called Bridgetown. And so we started attending Bridgetown virtually from Phoenix because everyone was attending church virtually at the time. Every Sunday we would watch the live stream, like they would talk about rule of life. I think in general, that church community in Portland has been really incubating this kind of curriculum for spiritual disciplines and for discipleship for years. And it was all new to me. It was relevant to what was happening in culture. It wasn't like partisan or anything. It was very orthodox to, the word of God. But it sort of the soil was very fertile for that seed that came in that said, hey, there is actually a way for us to pursue Christ-likeness in our actions and thoughts. And as an only child who is weirdly obsessed with control and everything, like I loved that. I was like, I can do things to draw closer to God. Like, what are those things? And so that's where really a lot of it started. And since then, I've been able to build a relationship with John Mark, who's incredible. We're, part of his new organization, Practicing the Way, that's actually working to take what they've built in Portland and operationalize it across the global church, which has been really a blessing to be a part of. And so, I think like I opened with, I'm very new to a lot of this stuff, but, we're trying to implement a Sabbath practice within our home, thinking about prayer in a very different way. Fasting is sort of the next kind of big thing for us to really take on. So we're very excited about that. And God has really opened up a lot of doors in a weird way to get connected to John Mark and to Bridgetown and to Practicing the Way. And to me, that's just another example we talked about earlier of just taking faithful steps, seeing that I think there's a reason that I'm kind of moving in this direction. The Spirit's pushing me kind of in this direction. And so not knowing, where it's headed, but just taking the next step in front of me.
Wow. I love your intentionality, like taking steps to actually reach out to him and really integrating it into what you're doing now. I remember when I first heard about it from Alex, who was sharing with me that you're doing this. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I love John Mark and Practicing the Way. And, we're actually diving into that even more. We can actually link that into the description for people who want to learn about that. It's really, really helpful because they do have free resources for you to learn more. I'll just share a really quick funny story. That book, I was listening to this book on 1.75 or no 1 point something x speed, and I was driving and I was so into the book Ruthless Elimination of Hurry that I was speeding and I didn't even realize. Yeah. And then a cop pulled me over.
Oh no.
And I ended up getting a ticket. And
oh no.
It was just God's funny way of being like, you need to take this seriously. Just because you're listening to this book or reading this book, you need to live it out, not just, listen to and absorb in your head. Just like you said, none of us are perfect. We're still learning. But I think if people can just be encouraged, like you don't have to be perfect or nail it right away, but just take little steps of like, how could I integrate this into my everyday life or my work? I think just the attempt of doing it goes a long way.
That's why I really like the term, nothing wrong with the term spiritual disciplines, but I like the term spiritual practices that John Mark has kind of been hooking onto, because you're not perfect. Like there was only one who has ever walked to this earth that was perfect. And so this is about a pursuit of Christ-likeness. And so I think about it through context of practices. I give myself a little permission to say, hey, like I don't have to feel like I'm a horrible kind of Christian if I, didn't fast that day because I had a big event at work or whatever, the situation is. It's about sort of like everything in life and sports and everything, learning from practice in pursuit of perfection, which for us is pursuing Christ. So for whatever it's worth, I think that took a little bit of pressure off me in this sort of journey.
Yeah, it's all about practice. And I know you're a Kobe Bryant fan.
I am.
Yeah, he's a prime example of that.
Yeah, totally.
So you talked about Sabbath with your family. Can you sort of walk us through your typical workday and your schedule and how everything just integrates together, both personally and at work?
Yeah, totally. So, I think one of the big eye-opening things for me on Sabbath in particular was just how much the sort of 6-day on, 1-day off rhythm is hard-coded into not just people, but like literally just every kind of form of life on this planet. In my earlier parts of my career, Saturdays were a great day to catch up on work. It was a great day to get ahead. It was a great day to whatever. And I think the big kind of aha moment with Sabbath in particular was, okay, not only is this thing like actually in line with, physiological makeup of my personhood, two, it's this free gift where we get to like pursue joy and put our anxieties away and just, worship in every sort of extension of the word. So it's like a free thing that we're given that we just don't take God up on very often. And so that sort of changed it. And then I think the piece as a professional, as an entrepreneur, an executive that kind of changed it for me was I can be better in my 6 days if I take this one day and completely disconnect from work, completely get away from it. Because there have been some days, the entrepreneurship thing is pretty new to me, but it's like, you're on the road or you're just emotional, a lot of highs and lows, a lot of context switching from like, a customer signs and an investor like may not believe, and then an employee, resigns. And then like, you get a great piece of, coverage and press, and you're just like that batting back and forth is just so exhausting. So I found that Sabbath almost saves me every Friday night because I'm just like, I'm not transitioning into this like fading into Sabbath as an entrepreneur. I'm sliding into home and just like, it's a hard stop into Sabbath dinner every Friday night. And what I find is I can get back up on Sunday afternoon, evening when I'm getting back on my emails, certainly Monday morning, in a way that I thought would be impossible based on how exhausted I felt on Friday. And so absolutely, I found it to be extremely, extremely impactful. And I found, back to the idea of practices, when I break it, I'm a mess. Like my Monday, I'm not in a great place, and it's hard for me to get going again. It's by Monday afternoon, Tuesday morning till I find my rhythm again for the week. So I definitely find that to be true. But outside the context of Sabbath, or I think they say there is some saying around like that the Sabbath, the dividends or the fruits of the Sabbath kind of play out throughout your week as well. And so for me, it's really just being intentional with time. It's making sure that I'm starting my morning in prayer and solitude and trying to kind of orient myself that way, spending as much time with my kids before logging on for the day, which is not much, but whether it's breakfast or something. And then like, honestly, just being extremely impactful for my time where I'm clocked in proverbially, and then setting up the right boundaries after work. And that happens in a couple of ways. One, dinner with the family every single night. And then when I'm traveling, my commitment to my wife is that I'll be home by Sabbath. So if I'm gone, 2 or 3 days, like I'm taking the flight Thursday night or Friday morning to make sure I'm back home when I need to be. So it goes back to this idea of work as an expression of purpose versus identity. It's and how you sort of stack rank, the importance. I'm going to try to, optimize my life around my walk with Jesus and my relationship with my wife and kids, and then develop this sort of rhythm around work where for those, 8-9 hours that I'm at work, I am impactful and I am present and I am not distracted because of the investment made outside of those hours, if that makes sense.
In reality, a lot of people struggle. And I think part of that is because our culture, promotes this hustling, always working around the clock. And even though we, want to take Sabbath or want to be resting, there's just constant external and internal pressure to be on. So can you just dive a little bit? I'm wondering, like, emotionally speaking, when you have those tension points of, there's a, business opportunity, or this could really help our company in the long term, but, you have family obligations. What do you do internally to help you remember what's truly important?
Yeah. again, it's imperfect, but catching up where you need to catch up, but not at the cost of, again, your walk or your relationships with your family. So for example, yesterday was a heavy Monday, a lot of meetings, didn't get through my email, but we have, some big kind of customer relationships that are being developed. After the kids kind of went to bed, I pulled the laptop out a little bit and worked a little bit, and that's okay. But I tried not to just come home and transition from work to the drive home to like back to work. It was like, no, I need to like be very thoughtful about this like 2-hour window and then give myself permission to catch up later at the cost of my own sleep, maybe. But like, I'd rather make that trade-off than, at the cost of that time with the kids. So part of it is just like, when you're a busy parent, especially, or you're just busy with other kind of obligations kind of beyond work, everything's trade-off when it comes to time. Everything is a trade-off. And sometimes you have to lean more into work, and sometimes, you have it a little bit easier and you don't have to, you can kind of, fill up in kind of other areas, fill up your time in other areas. I will comment on the external pressure though, because I think as a society, we've reached a bit of a tipping point with hustle culture, with this endless pursuit of productivity, with, do more with less. Like, we're just continually been hitting that drumbeat for so long. And I think what we saw with COVID was all of that just stopped, and suddenly it didn't matter. And we were like all at home, a whole kind of spectrum of emotions, and we still had to go to work every day. And we did through virtual and through other things. And there were some really good things that came from that. There were some things that are not. But I think even outside the context of Christians who are working in the workplace, I think we're tired of working in cultures where that's kind of what's going to be demanded of us. And so I would say, if you're listening and you're like, hey, I don't feel supported in my current workplace to have any margin in my life, whatever that is, or if I were to sort of think about taking a step and building a rule of life or whatever, I feel like I would fail at work or get fired. I would definitely question whether you should stay at that company. Not to be dramatic, but I think that we need to be really thoughtful about the values of the businesses that we join and the cultures that are being created, because that's not ultimately, like, it's not sustainable. And to your point from the last episode, like burning out and having even health scares and everything, it's just not worth it. And I promise you, there is a company out there that is values driven, and it will kind of champion kind of the whole person, not just as a function of attracting great new teammates, but actually discipling their existing employees and helping them develop and be great at work kind of along the way. So I wanted to just speak to that, because I think many of us are working for companies that aren't going to perhaps, let us adopt a lot of things I'm saying. And I would just challenge like whether or not that's the right place.
I'm sure people will be listening to this and wonder if you're hiring. So
there's a company called AudiencePlus.
Yeah, right. Exactly. One of our, this is kind of interesting, but one of our values is ruthlessly eliminate hurry. And we've sort of implemented, much like Gainsight, by the way, I think by other language, a digital Sabbath on Saturdays. So no email, no Slack, like those types of things.
Wow.
We pay for people to go on vacation once a year, just to actually like try to like run away from the unlimited PTO thing where people don't take PTO, but actually encourage them to find rest and all of that sort of thing. And we challenge, we ruthlessly work to eliminate signal of hurry within our business, which is not speed. Speed is working fast in a direction where there's alignment of resources and vision and good communication. We can work with haste, but hurry happens when there is no vision, where there's bad communication, where the team got cut in half and the expectations doubled. And that's where the seeds of hurry get planted within a culture. So we take this to heart in kind of how we're building the company, where everyone at the business has permission to call out hurry when they see it. And we have to figure out a way to adapt and make sure that we're not leading us into that burnout direction.
That's good.
I love that. It sounds like such a great culture to work for you.
Hopefully, yeah, we're excited about it. We're excited.
And you're looking up on the jobs page after.
Yes. So now that we have sort of a picture of you now with the rule of life and practices, I'm just really curious, what was AK like before rule of life? Like, how did you work? What was going on internally? I'm sure externally was crazy too, but more internally.
Yeah. Well, it led to me in a hospital with heart arrhythmia. So it wasn't good is the punchline. I think that I put so high of an emphasis, and I still beat this thought back when it happens, because it just happens, I think, to any high achiever or anyone that's, super ambitious. But like, I put so much emotion into my work. I can't help it. And so when things are going good, I'm just like super fired up. And again, have to now be aware of those dopamine spikes. And then when things aren't good, I used to bring that home with me, and I still struggle sometimes with that. The person that actually really helped me with that was Nick Kennada, our CEO from Gainsight.
Oh, wow.
There was there was a moment where we were walking around the block because I was like, I need to talk to you. I'm so frustrated with something. And then we're walking around, and him being the good CEO that he is, the great CEO that he is, just like let me vent and kind of tell him how I was feeling about probably the stupidest thing ever, like a campaign or a landing page, whatever. And at the end of it, he's like, basically like, are you done? I'm like, yeah. And, and he was like, dude, it's just a job.
Wow.
And
Your CEO said that.
My
Our
our CEO, the person who I was working hard to perform for, who I cared about delivering and all of that sort of stuff. And he just helped me, I think, like realize that, again, even when things are at their best or worst within work, it's just a job. And that really helped change kind of my feeling and trying to not take the emotion out of my work, but again, go back to like a healthier relationship with it. And I've spent a lot of time actually talking after this health scare with CEOs who are much older than me, who have gone before, who are some that are like even elderly at this point. And they cite this as actually one of the ways they maintained their health as they built companies. Like physical health, not just spiritual health, was this idea of not bringing work home with you and kind of keeping the emotions kind of, at bay a little bit. So I found that to be really wise because to answer your question, if things weren't going good at work, weren't going good at home, and I was frustrated, and it would show up in my relationships and that sort of thing.
This is like another episode in itself, but I can totally relate with that because I think this was last year or the year before when I was talking to my therapist. She's a Christian too. So I was just sharing like, I don't get it. My work, I love it so much. I'm so into it, but I just have so much trouble balancing like the rest of my life. And she basically challenged me to envision my life as a pie. And then through that exercise, I realized that almost all my thoughts were revolving around work, when in reality, life is so much more than just that work, right?
Yeah.
But I do think, back to your point, when you're talking about like hustle culture and what's glorified now, we just hear so many people and amazing, very quote unquote successful people talking about they're obsessed with their work. That's all they can do, all they can think about, eat, sleep, work. It's all blended together. And so I do think, just to your point about like, how do we separate ourselves from work and remember work, it's not our identity. It's not who we are. It's a part of our lives and our stewardship, but it's not our end all be all.
Yeah.
When we were talking about this question, we really want to hear your thoughts on the future of work, like business, entrepreneurship, even creative, marketing that you're in.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see spiritual disciplines? What role do you see it playing when it comes to excelling in all these areas as a believer?
Yeah. Well, it feels like spiritual disciplines, spiritual practices, creating a rule of life, just sort of this renewed focus on discipleship. I think it'll go from being a fringe thing that we read about in some books or out of a church in Portland or whatever to mainstream within the local church. And I don't think that will come from like, doesn't matter how amazing like organizations like Practicing the Way are, it will only come from two things: a move of God that I believe is happening, but two, this sort of like desperation of people who I think are drawn to this conversation around faith and work, because as we increasingly work and seek to find success in industries, many secular industries, we are increasingly working in a post-Christian context. Just sort of this notion of like praying the sinner's prayer and then get back out there isn't going to cut it for us. Like we need to be investing in our foundations. We need to be seeking Christ actively. We need to be using the spirit that raised Jesus from the dead that lives inside of us, this powerful concept. Like it's ridiculous that we don't often just like wake up and just
it's untapped
like
potential.
blow our minds. Exactly. That all of this is within us and available to us, and a gift to us that we don't deserve, but we have. Unless we're sort of leveraging it, harnessing it out of desperation, frankly, of moving forward, I think it's just going to be extremely difficult to operate as believers in any industry moving forward. And the relationship with work is going to be even harder than we had it, I think, for our children. So I think that this conversation is happening, and there's people that are, it's increasingly getting into the forefront of our dialogue, I would say, as a global church community. And I think it's coming at the perfect time because from a societal, cultural perspective, like we need to reinvest and reignite discipleship into our own lives in order to just exist and be in this next chapter of work.
Yeah, that reminds me of a verse. I think it's from Matthew 16. For what shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world and loses his soul? So what you were saying just reminded me of that, because we can increase revenue by X, get promoted 3 times within 1 year, but all that for the loss of your soul is meaningless. So thank you for sharing that, man. What would be your top recommendation for a practical step that listeners could take this week to begin incorporating those spiritual disciplines into their work life?
I mean, it started with me with that book. So if you pick up Ruthlessly Eliminate Hurry, maybe don't read it while driving. Read it at the comfort of your home.
Yes.
I'm kidding. Or listen to it or whatever. Sorry. I think that just getting read up on this stuff, right? And read and think in 1 Corinthians where it talks about, the giftings of the Spirit, the manifestations of the Spirit. You see that like there are resources to kind of get started with this stuff. I don't want to sound like a Practicing the Way commercial, but like I think they're trying to codify that and actually create small group resources. And there's like podcasts you can listen to around it. And so I'd encourage you to check that out. But I think, like anything in life, starting small, like thinking like what's one little thing, I think is the root of your question. Whether that's, hey, this Saturday, I'm going to take this like digital appendage that I have and put it in a drawer for 24 hours. I'm going to seek disconnection and slow down and try to, just be intentional with my day. I think that's a decent place to start and just invite the Spirit to work in your life for those 24 hours. So I'd probably start there, but there's a lot of good wisdom on this that's starting to get written.
Yeah, I love that podcast. I think also for anyone who struggles with doing it and just staying disciplined, I think one thing that helps a lot is just bringing other people with you to do it together to keep each other accountable. So even if you have just one other person, 2 other people in your life that you're like, maybe they'd be interested in doing this with me, taking a Sabbath on Saturdays.
We've loved like creating a bit of a ritual around how we open Sabbath. So Friday night and doing a Sabbath dinner. And so that's been really fun, whether it's just you and your family or you and your community or whatever, but like have this like amazing, fun, like killer dinner on Friday nights that help kind of start the spirit of Sabbath, on a super high note. So I love that idea of bringing community into it.
Right. It is meant to be a fun communal thing anyway, when you look at the biblical context. So well, thank you so much, Anthony. This was so eye-opening, enlightening. Before we end, what are you currently working on these days and how can people find you if they want to connect?
Yeah. Thanks for having me on. I'm starting a company called AudiencePlus, and that's taking, 6 days of my life very intentionally. But no, it's, if you go to audienceplus.com, you can subscribe there. We're creating a lot of content around media and how the intersection of content and media and experiences with business, with B2B specifically. And so if you're a marketer or a founder or someone interested in that topic in general, that'd be a great place to check out and stay in touch.
Great. Thanks, AK. Really appreciate you.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
If you liked our podcast, we want to ask you to help more people learn how to grow closer to God and experience the fullness He has for them by taking just 30 seconds right now to rate and review this podcast or like and subscribe on YouTube. It's a small action, but it makes a big difference so we can continue serving you with resources like this.
And we'd love to hear from you about your reflections and questions for us to unpack in the future. We invite you to share this episode and tag us and follow us for more encouragement and helpful tools for living fully the way God designed you to.
We pray that God fills you with His love, His joy, His peace, and His wisdom as you continue growing in your daily walk with Him. We're so grateful for you, and we can't wait to see you again next week. See you soon.